So I'm just coming out of a table where we had some pretty cool, interesting discussion on some of the future of pollinator research in Colorado. I'm sure everybody's getting heated in some conversation in their respective booths. Julian, Jess, David, if you'd like to join me back here, it'd be great to have you guys join us for a little more policy, like panel discussion type format. I think it'd be good if we could wrap up a little before 3, like 2:45 or 2:50, so that I can get prepped for the kind of concluding remarks for the summit. But we can see how it goes.
I think Jess is still participating in the breakout group about natural history.
I imagine that the natural history was a popular table. I mean, we're all fascinated by pollinators, so it's definitely probably a lot of conversation going on there. So I'm kind of curious, guys, if anybody has questions. I know that you guys have been answering a lot of questions already from the chat or from your respective tables. But if folks still have questions, feel free and drop them in the chat. Sorry, I had to refresh my browser so that I can see them. And I'll try and reiterate them to the group. I was just kind of curious because it's a question we get asked a lot. And we discussed a little bit in the future of research. What do you think about the role of lethal sampling in terms of research on pollinators? You know, we see it as kind of a necessary thing that we have to do. We care about these organisms, right? But the reality is most of our wild pollinators are really hard to identify from a photograph or on the wing. And so what's the role of lethal sampling? How might we mitigate its impacts on these things which we're trying to conserve? Any thoughts from any of our panelists?
I just brought up in the citizen science group I was hanging out in, the paper that was done here, trying to see if there was an impact, a long-term impact of pan trapping on bee populations. And the fortunate outcome of that experimental work is that we weren't able to detect any long-term consequences of the pan trapping, even though you're sometimes removing hundreds of bees a week. So that's the only study I'm aware of that has actually looked carefully at what are the consequences of collecting and can it be over collecting. The pan traps don't collect bumblebees very often at all. So we do netting to census those, and those we keep long enough to identify them. And in the very rare case where we have trouble identifying them in the field, we may collect an individual to bring it back to the lab.
Yeah, and definitely, like within researchers, I've seen a concerted effort to try and identify, you know, potentially vulnerable groups. And so if you're surveying the entire bee community and you're catching bees in May, for instance, here along the Front Range, chances are those bumblebees that you're catching are queens. And so photograph those that you catch early in May, those really big queens, and release them. Bumblebees here right along the Front Range, for people that are interested, are actually pretty good by photograph. You can't always tell what species they are. The higher up you go, it gets a little more difficult. The farther west you go, it gets a little more difficult. But for sure, there are some vulnerable groups which if we don't have to sample, we probably shouldn't, right? Take the western bumblebee. If you see a bumblebee, right, Jess, with a white bum, try not to collect it because we think that it may be a species that's declining and moving up in elevation, right? So.
Yeah, in our work, we made sure not to capture queens in the early spring, and we uploaded photos of all of them to iNaturalist and Bumblebee Quest. And Bumblebee Quest is also a great bumblebee identification resource. But maybe I'm biased, but I'm for lethal sampling with caution. And I think that using a hand net instead of traps is a more cautious way. And then that way you can also record floral record. If you're putting vane traps or pan traps out in areas where there are not flowers already, really hungry bees are going to run to them and die. So it's better, I say, to use a net. And there's been some peer-reviewed research that agrees with me on that one.
I pointed out in the citizen science group that it won't be too many years before we'll have a little handheld device where you can pick off part of a bee leg and drop it in and get a species ID based on the DNA, but can't quite do that yet.
And I should point out to like our attendees who are concerned about us as researchers, there are people who are trying to develop methods that we can employ to identify bees without lethally sampling them. And, you know, it's exceedingly difficult. So you saw tons of beautiful pictures in Jess's talk of bees, those pictures taken by the USGS and Sam Droege. You know, that takes a lot of technology, computing power, and storage just to make those images. And reality is, if anybody's tried, photographing a small bee on a flower is really, really hard. You know, I've been contacted from researchers who are interested in acoustic sampling for bees. Has anybody ever heard about this? So bees make, you know, a buzz, right? Bees buzz. And so different sized bees buzz at different frequencies. So how cool would it be if you could just, like you can do for bird calls now, if you're a birder in the southeastern United States, you can record the entire, you know, symphony of bees buzzing on the meadow and at least estimate the relative abundance of different sized bees there potentially. That's pretty cool, right? And I think that might be an interesting segue to another question. In the citizen science group, I'm sure you got this, in the future research group, we talked about this, is that, you know, the taxonomy is really an impediment to new researchers in particular who want to break into studying pollinators, right? Because bees in particular are so hard to identify. Julian knows this. He's brought over bees to us. Jess knows this. She started in my lab as an undergrad and subsequently became a bee researcher. And so what do you think is the value of a coarser resolution? So Jess talked about a paper that said, you know, higher resolution, you know, taxonomic data usually mirrors what we see at lower resolution. And so there's a lot of citizen scientists out there that are doing the best they can. Do you think there's still a lot of value in that data?
I do. I think it depends on the questions you want to ask. There are some questions that you can't ask at that resolution, but for what I was talking about, I could. I don't know what Julian and David think about that for their work.
I think it depends on the question. I think it's probably good enough for a lot of purposes, and for some things you might really want to, particularly if you want to work on the population level, you definitely have to know what's interbreeding with which individuals are breeding with each other. Because if you're looking at, you know, multiple species at the same time, you could have different things going on. I wanted to mention one thing about the collecting, which is that I think as researchers we have an obligation that if we collect stuff and we kill it, we need to make sure that it gets curated and put in a museum, and so it's useful for other people. Because beyond the use of the data we're interested in, those specimens can be really useful for purposes that we don't know about yet. And if they're not in a museum, then they lose that value. So I wanted to say that we do have that obligation. About collecting, there are some cases where I think collecting is problematic with butterflies, especially with rare butterflies and amateur collectors. There can be some serious concerns. I'm reading this book by Nick Haddad about the rarest butterflies in the world, and some of these things are sought after sometimes because they're rare. And so I think that pollinators in general aren't declining because people are collecting them. They're declining because of things like habitat loss and pesticides. But I think when things get really rare, we want to be thoughtful about collecting.
So I've got a couple other questions of my own I wouldn't mind asking. I mean, you know, I would be super interested in hearing David's opinion of what he thinks some of our biggest threats to Colorado's pollinators are, right? When I was in the southeastern United States, the suite of threats that pollinators face there is probably a lot different from here in the Rocky Mountains. On the one hand, we've got some pristine wilderness areas, right? We're so lucky here to have those. And yet, from your own data, you've shown that some of those most pristine areas may be some of the most imperiled, right? Because of how they're responding to climate change. So would you classify climate change as the biggest threat to Colorado's pollinators?
Probably so. I mean, we've seen from other sites that pesticides can be a big problem, that urbanization and habitat loss can be big problems. But given that so much of Colorado doesn't have those problems, I was really quite surprised when we did the analysis this past winter to find that there'd been such a strong decline in the malaise trap samples. Now those don't catch many bees, but mostly the Diptera showed the strongest effect. I remember back in the early 80s, we had a couple of summers here when I had a graduate student, Carol Kearns, working on fly pollination. She was looking at linum, the blue flax flowers, and every flower would have 4, 5, 6, 10 muscoid flies on it, eating nectar, going after the pollen. And we just never see those anymore. After about 2 years of that, the population crashed. And I think it was a fungal epidemic that went through the population, because we would find these dead flies with swollen abdomens that looked like they were full of fungal spores just hanging on to the vegetation. And at that point, I didn't know what was normal. Was the super high population of flies we were seeing on linum the normal, or was that abnormal? And I guess I have to say, after 25 or more years now of not seeing that happen again, that it must have been abnormally high populations of flies for those few years when she was doing her dissertation work. So I think, yeah, we have to point to the changing climate as having a big effect here in the parts of Colorado that aren't so affected by some of these other problems that pollinators face elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I would probably like to wrap up with a question to each of you. Maybe we can go in order from Jess to Julian to David, as you've got a captive audience here, right? And you've got a group of people here right now, 103 still watching us, who are concerned about pollinators in Colorado. As researchers who are studying these things, what would you recommend be some of our next steps? How can they make a difference in their conservation? Where do you think's the cream of the crop? Where do we get the biggest bang for our buck? They want to affect conservation. So, Jess, what do you think?
I think all too often leaving it alone is ignored. So leave your yard alone, don't mow it a bunch, just like Dave Golson talked about earlier. And then when big floods come through, yes, there are weeds that we see unsightly and crack willow that maybe isn't native, but it's a really important resource for bees. So think about that. And yeah, I think just because it doesn't look like it belongs, maybe that's not true.
Awesome. How about you, Julian?
So I would say, get involved locally and at the state level in protecting our open spaces. And so we are so lucky to have a lot of public lands and open space, and they are often under threat. So I would say, get involved and protect our open spaces.
Yeah. And David?
A couple of thoughts. One is that there is a North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, nappc.org is their website, also pollinator.org. And one of the things that they have promoted is the profile of trying to raise the profile of pollinators in North America. And so we now have national and state Pollinator Week. It's about the second or third week in June, I think, usually. And Governor Polis this year was one of the people, one of the governors, all 50 governors, who designated a state pollinator week. So you can pay attention to what those organizations like the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, the activities that they organize for those pollinator weeks. I think there have been enough studies now showing that if you plant floral resources, the pollinators will come. Even if you're planting in downtown in a large urban area, if the flowers are there, the bees are going to show up. So it doesn't matter where you live, urban, suburban, rural, if you help promote floral resources, that's going to help the pollinators. Maybe particularly in years like we're seeing now, where drought is such an issue for native wildflowers in the wild, that maybe having some of those native wildflowers in your yard where you can water them and keep them flowering and producing pollen and nectar, that could be a big way to help support native pollinators.
Yeah. Awesome. And all really great points from all three of you. I mean, great ways that people can have an impact. And, to our attendees right now who we're talking to, you're taking the first step. If you're not a researcher, you're just joining us, you're here to inform yourself about pollinators, right? And you just learned a heck of a lot about pollinators and pollinator research here in Colorado. So I think, this has been a really great session in my opinion. And I just want to say, thanks again, a really great big thanks to all three of you for coming and all of our attendees for participating in it. So I think we'll probably take like a 10-minute break and then we'll wrap up on the main page here in just a few. And I'll have some concluding remarks. So yeah, thanks again, you guys. It's been great.
Great job organizing, Adrian. Thanks for your leadership on that.
All right.
Thanks,
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.